This is the third presentation on the gender material. In this presentation, we will be switching from discussing kind of gender differentiation, gender socialization, to gender stratification. And this material is broken up across two presentations. This presentation will introduce the idea of gender stratification and then talk about the extent to which it exists in the higher education system as well as the labor force. And then presentation 4 will address gender stratification in politics as well as kind of crime, specifically gender violence. So just to reestablish kind of the sociological position on gender, the idea is that difference does exist, and most of that difference is due to differential socialization, but that difference is overstated. With everyone kind of cutting their own deal with the dominant definitions of gender, men and women are much more alike, especially in contemporary society, than they have ever been. And so it does raise the question, why do we overstate the differences between men and women if most of the difference that we have found between men and women is largely nominal and not and not really important or significant in most ways. What are the consequences of us acting as if men and women are dramatically different beings, especially if we also take up the argument that men and women are dramatically different and these differences are largely rooted in biology. Well, this is where our kind of discussion goes from just discussing gender differentiation into gender stratification. Because when people put those ideas out there that men and women are very different and that these differences are largely rooted in biology and therefore are immutable or unchangeable, there can be dire consequences. If the people that are putting forth these ideas are people that have power in society, this can contribute to inequality. And so remember, stratification is about inequality more so than differentiation. So it's not just about whether men and women are different, but it is the idea that for some people the argument is men and women are different and men are suited for some jobs more so than women, and most of those jobs are the jobs that happen to come with status and wealth and power in society. And this is how we wind up with a gender stratified society, going back to that stratification image of a ladder, right? So the idea that men, especially historically, have been kind of on the top rung of the ladder while women have been below men on the ladder. And so a big part of the rest of this presentation and the upcoming presentation is really just exploring to what extent is this still true. So just to note, gender inequality has existed in almost all known societies. There were a few matriarchies in early hunting and gathering societies, but most societies, past and certainly present, there has been gender inequality, and men have almost always been favored over women. They've been in that higher position. And that's because the ability to earn money is associated with things like power, wealth, and status. And so this has affected women's social position, the extent to which they could fully participate in the labor force, and impacted their ability to be treated as full citizens and to acquire wealth in their own right, their own name, and status. And if you look at it across a historical sense, as I've already kind of noted, some of the more egalitarian societies existed back in the hunting and gathering time period. And that's because although hunting usually came with more status, more clout, due to the nature of hunting and just the availability of game, women produce nearly as much food as men by being gatherers. And so therefore, in a lot of tribes, they were more equal in terms of power and prestige than they were in the later kind of time periods. When hunting and gathering societies became agricultural, agrarian, pastoral societies, although farming was very important, trade and warfare also became central features of social organization. And so while women did pitch in and provide a lot of help on their own farms, because they spent years pregnant or nursing infants, they were less likely to become merchants or warriors, which affected at that point, particularly their power and prestige within the social organization. As we moved out of agricultural societies into industrial societies, there were no longer these requirements of physical survival, economic, and although yes, women still, of course, were reproducing. The work that was done during industrial society no longer was such that they were not able, or they could have not been able to participate despite being pregnant, despite being infants. So there weren't these constraints, but in a lot of ways, gender became even more stratified. Women lost even more power and prestige and participation in the labor force than they had in even the agricultural society. And so, this raises the question of why. And this seems like as good a time as any to just kind of introduce the term sexism, which your book does go over. That once again what you have are the ideas and actions of the dominant group to largely keep the subordinate group in an inferior position. And so here when we're talking about gender, it is, at this point, if there were no longer these kind of biological constraints, if they no longer played as large of a role as they did in earlier time periods, how much of what then happened to women in the industrial and post-industrial eras was due to sexism. And so a lot of this early sexism can kind of just be tied into this belief in what Talcott Parsons, a sociologist, called traditional sex roles. And it's the idea that men had an instrumental role in society. They made money, they held positions of authority in both the labor sector as well as political sectors, and that women had an expressive role, right? They made life nice, beautiful, by caretaking and supporting their husband and their children. He thought that this was a functional way in which to organize society because men could therefore concentrate on being providers, and women could concentrate on being caretakers, and that no one was stretched thin by having to do both. Of course, the problem there being is that one set of those roles, of course, comes with additional resources besides just appreciation. It came with a paycheck and the ability to generate not just income but wealth. It came with more prestige and power. And when we think about some of the complaints that women had during the 1950s and 1960s, it was tied up with this idea, not so much that all women hated being caretakers, but it did make them financially dependent on their spouses. And so if something happened to their spouse, it certainly left them in a very bad position. The fact is because they were seen as being belonging in the home, it made it difficult for them to gain any type of political power or participate fully in politics, despite having the right to vote. And so you can't really talk about gender stratification, although the stratification did exist before the industrial period, without emphasizing that a lot of what has kept gender stratification going is still this belief, and the belief varies depending on households, depending on what your religious faith dictates. In these kind of traditional gender roles, in this idea of the separate fears. And so even today, there is still people that very much support this idea and strongly believe that families work best, that gender dynamics, gender relations go more smoothly when you have men in the instrumental role and women in the expressive role. But obviously, beginning in the 1960s and increasing with every decade since then, there has been a lot of pushback and rejection of these traditional gender roles as well. And so this brings me to the beginning of discussing how does gender stratification play out and exist across four different sectors. And the first sector we'll be talking about is higher education. So in the past, it was very clear. Very few women went to college, and this had everything to do with the fact that education, especially higher education, just wasn't seen as necessary for women, given the fact that their role was going to be in the home as a caretaker and engaging in domestic activities. There was even some bad science that came out then that indicated things like if women's brains increased, then it would impact their ability, it would impact their uterus and their ability to have children. And so, we really just didn't see a lot of women in college. That started to change really beginning in the 1960s. You'll see that during the 40s, the 30s and 40s, we saw an increase in women's participation, but then it dramatically dipped down in the 1950s. And part of that, of course, is also due to the fact that post World War II, so many more men went to college on the GI Bill. But beginning in the 60s, you start to see a significant increase in the number of women. And this was dramatically increased by the time we reached the 1970s, going into the 1980s, because Title IX was passed in 1972, and that pretty much made gender discrimination in a lot of different forms illegal in educational systems and educational systems that received any type of federal funding, which is most in America. And so what we started to see beginning in the 80s and steadily increasing ever since is that women pretty much now outnumber men in most colleges and most college programs. This is true across all racial ethnic groups, which we'll see on a later slide. And the only exception we sometimes see here is in STEM fields, and therefore in colleges where the focus is on STEM. There has been a bit of a lag in the number of women that enroll in STEM programs, STEM meaning science, technology, engineering, and math. So, as I indicated, this gap between men and women in college exists across all racial groups, with the most narrow of the gap being between Asian Americans, and the largest gap being between African Americans, although it's worth noting, there are also pretty sizable gaps that exist in Latinos and Native Americans as well. And it's not just undergraduate education, although we saw the increase of women first there. You can also see that while men are still outnumbering women in professional degrees like dentistry, law, and medicine, this gap has dramatically decreased. And I know, for instance, in some of these programs, in more recent years, they're pretty much now at parity. So, one thing that this is really the one form or the one sector of society where you have men and women switching place on the rungs of the ladder. You do have more women in college, and that trend doesn't seem likely to change, which for some educational scholars, higher educational scholars, this does raise the question, is it time to consider affirmative action for men? And it's worth noting that some programs already have different schools have special scholarships for men who would like to consider female dominated fields, particularly things like education has some men in teaching scholarships and funding available, and nursing in the past has also offered that. And they're increasing colleges, if not offering affirmative action, at least offering specific initiatives to keep men in college. Because part of this is reflects, of course, some concern, about what does that mean. What are the kind of trickle down effects if men do not go to college. I indicated when we talked about the difference between pink collar and blue collar jobs that there are good jobs available for in these stereotypically, masculine fields, that don't require college degrees. And so I want to emphasize some men who don't go to college. It's not because they don't go on to have economically productive lives. In the same way that for women who don't go to college, there are less stereotypical female not jobs that don't require college degrees that are also well paying. But there are concerns, of course, and these discussions come up when you talk about family formation. We know that people oftentimes want to marry someone that has a similar level of education that they do. And if there are these kind of growing gaps, particularly in minority communities, between who is college educated and who isn't, is this perhaps what is factoring into declining marriage rates among this group? And and is also what is impacting, of course, wealth building, which is easier to do with two people, as opposed to one person. And so this is just something that is worth thinking about and considering, and certainly a lot of schools are. That is not seen as being ideal when you have a very large female male ratio on your college campus. Despite these gains on the college side of things, it's worth noting when we then talk about gender stratification in the labor force. Increases in college education has not eliminated the kind of gender inequality that exists in the work world, and that inequality is still kind of looks like the expected male dominated stratification that we no longer see in the world of college. And so we're going to talk a little bit about why that is. So first of all, in general, when we think about, why Americans work, we are a society that in addition to, of course, the kind of need for money, we also see that there's a real value in working, right? We have the term work ethic. We say things like hard work builds character, and all of that just suggests that for Americans, right, it is a cultural belief, in the significance of being a working, contributing member of society. And this has always been true of what we think about men, of course, right? We have this notion that men need to be providers. And so in this way, when men fail in the labor force, there's a saying that they're unsexed by failure, meaning, can you be thought of as a man, a real man, if you're not holding down a job, if you are not providing steady work, just because work features so prominently in our ideas of masculinity in this country. However, for women, it's a little bit more complicated because generally, historically, femininity has not been defined by women's relationships or women's existence in the labor force. And so we can say for women, there is the risk of being unsexed by success, right? If women become too successful in the world of work, there's always this question of, if she's single, this sense of, I bet it's because she did not prioritize finding a partner and starting a family. And if she does have a partner and a family, there's this sense of, unlike for men, where people don't really necessarily question the amount of time that he is spending away from home or away from his family. For women, if you are successful in the world of work and is seen that your job takes you out of your home, there are these questions about, who's raising the kids, and, what does that mean about, her being a good mother. And so these ideas, this ideology, certainly impacts how people perceive men and women in the labor force. And this is important because, as you can see, women, although they are not at parity with men, it's not 50-50. We are reaching that point where men and women are participating in the labor force in increasingly equal numbers, compared to, what we were, during the 1950s, or certainly what we were at the turn of the century in the 1900s. More women are making up a larger part of the labor force. And of course, this varies by state, as your book indicates. There's some states that have very few women in the workforce, less than average, and then there are some states that have more than average women in the workforce. Um, and all those purple states, is a lot of them do exist in the South, and a lot of that's probably related to the South being the Bible Belt, and still some very traditional ideals about instrumental and expressive roles, and about you know separate spheres. um, but then also you have the Southwest and California, and probably two contributing factors there, that you have a large Latino communities in those states, and that is a community that is a little bit has more conservative ideals in regards to gender, in some cases. But then also in a state like California, the presence of people that make a lot of money, and therefore don't necessarily need both partners, or both spouses to work. Now, for the women who are working, there's several different ways in which we can kind of talk about to what extent are they still experiencing inequality. One of those ways we can talk about it is the wage gap. And so, although there might be state laws that require equal pay for equal work, these laws are really difficult to enforce, largely because there has not necessarily been a requirement for jobs to make public their pay data by individual, or even by gender. In 2009, the Lilly Ledbetter Act was passed by Congress, which required transparency so that workers could demand to know what people who held their job made. And of course, the idea being, if people had that information and realized they were making less, then this would allow them to build a case to, ask for a raise, or demand a raise if they live in a state where such laws would necessitate them making the same as people, other people within their position. But it's worth noting that the last time the Paycheck Fairness Act was raised in Congress, which was 2014, it failed to pass. So, there is, in most states, there is not a kind of legal recourse if you find out you are not being paid the same as someone else with your same job. And so the wage gap, which is largely held steady at about 81 cents to a dollar, is kind of the how much money a woman makes per dollar compared to how much a man makes. For every male dollar, women make 81 cents. And there are many different ways you can kind of play around with this number. You can hold education constant. You can hold race constant, because the disparity does increase for women of color. if you don't mind the profanity, I give you a link to John Oliver, who did a segment a few years ago on the wage gap, and he goes through all of the different studies that have kind of tried to measure to what extent the wage gap does and doesn't exist. But it's worth noting that even when we hold everything perfectly constant, we can never get it down to parity, $1 to $1. We get it as high as, in some cases, even 96, 97 cents for some women at specific points in their lives with certain educational credentials. But even for those women, it's never a dollar. And this is significant because if women are paid less, they have less money, they have less discretionary income, therefore they maybe have less money to put towards investments. If they make less money, it might make banks less likely to offer them a mortgage loan if they're single. And that's important because for most Americans, a house is, of course, their main source of wealth, right? It's the primary asset that the average American might own. Um, Another consequence, of course, of the wage gap is that when it's time to retire, your Social Security is based on your last 6 years or your average, the average over your last 6 years of earnings. So if you made less money, that means you're going to receive less Social Security. So all of these things just kind of explain, why the wage gap is significant. Whether it is 20 cent, whether it is 5 cent, why it is important that what we don't have is perfect pay parity in this country. Then the next couple of slides just really indicate some of those points I was making. Like even if we break it down by education, the pay gap exists by educational levels. If we break it down by age, it exists even like 16 to 19, which is basically, when you might be working your, the type of job that you probably would work if you were working full time, 16 to 19. These are low wage, probably minimum wage jobs, but even so, somehow even here you still have men that have a slight edge, although this is one of the smaller gaps, as is 20 to 24. And then, of course, as I've already indicated, for race, the wage gap exists is even higher for racial minorities than it is for white women. And so, why does it exist, right? Several ideas here. One is just kind of blanket gender discrimination. It exists because people just flat out pay women less, or they don't hire women for certain positions, or they don't offer them promotions to the same extent as they do male candidates. And whether or not that discrimination, just a reminder from your race chapter, right? Sometimes discrimination is based on prejudice. So in this case, I'm using the word bias, right? But it's sometimes that discrimination might just be based on ideas that people have about men and women, where they judge men to be better workers, more competent leaders, more deserving of better pay, right? So that would be discrimination based on bias. Sometimes it might be not necessarily, it's still just discrimination, but it's based less on prejudice and bias and more of what we call homophily, like the desire to hire people who look like you, to hire people that fit in with the rest of the office workers. And this is especially can be problematic at like the management, upper level management, CEO level, right? That sense of, the person you mentor, the person you groom, looks like the other people that hold that position. This can be a way in which, even if it's not explicitly, based on prejudice against women, the result is still the same. If you don't currently have a lot of women in those positions and you're like, hey, we want to hire someone that fits in with the group, so we're going to go with this male candidate, even if you're not being spurred on by prejudice, the result is still the same, that you have women kind of being locked out of this position. The other two explanations as to why the wage gap exists require a little bit more discussion. because they're more sociological in nature, one of which is occupational sex segregation, which I'll talk about on the upcoming slide. The other one is what we call the motherhood penalty. And that is it's not women per se that people have bias against and discriminated against. It is women who have children or women who are expected to be having children. And that is because when women have children, they lose time away from work. This can be if they have a job that offers maternity leave, this can be up to months of time away from work. If they don't offer, maternity leave. There is still the mandatory, FMLA time that's unpaid, but women can take off up to, 10 weeks for a birth. And so this is time away from the job. And depending on the job, this might represent money loss. This might represent, if it's enough time away, skills lost. And so there is this argument, this rational choice argument that says if you have a young man and a young woman applying for a job and you expect that this young woman could go on to have 2 to 3 children, that this would be time away that you would not expect from that young man. And so therefore the rational thing to do if you are going to be investing in this early career and training, and pouring resources into this new hire, it is to hire the man. Especially since even after that time loss due to pregnancy and childbearing, we also know due to just the gender stereotypes associated with mothering versus fathering, that children will then continue to potentially be an impediment in the labor participation of women as they have to concern themselves with things like what happens if there is a snow day or delayed start, that they would have to make sure that someone is watching their child, and they would have to take that time off. Children have dentist appointments, they get sick, they have doctor's appointments. All of these things they don't necessarily have to fall on the mother, but oftentimes they are more likely to fall on the mother. And when they make that decision, to take that time off, that is coming away from their job. And so what you see is that some of the largest gaps that exist between men and women happen during those prime kind of child rearing years of 35, to 44. As you have men and women, and that sense of fatherhood versus motherhood responsibilities, playing out differently. And actually, there is a term called fatherhood premium, where instead of assuming that fatherhood makes a man a worse worker, which is the assumption behind the motherhood penalty, under the fatherhood premium, you have the assumption that men are better workers when they're fathers. They're more loyal to their jobs. They're less likely to leave, and that they might become more motivated to take on additional work in order to receive raises and promotions because of that idea of being providers. To the extent that motherhood penalty exists, this is a real consequence for women, because comparative to previous time periods, you have so many more women in the labor force when they have children. So what you see here is that not only are a lot of women in the labor force when they have children between the ages of 6 to 17, the years in which that their children are in school, but there are more women who are even participating in the labor force, even with children under the age of 6, relying on daycare or other forms of caretaking as they are also working. So the motherhood penalty contributes to the wage gap. And these are just graphs that show that even as women have earned more than their husbands, there hasn't been kind of a corresponding increase of stay-at-home parents who are dads, and that is part of why women who perhaps could be sole breadwinners in their family are usually not sole breadwinners within their family. Just adding to that kind of stress of if the person that's making less money isn't staying at home, if you don't have a lot of stay-at-home dads, then that does increase that whole who is going to be responsible for sick children, who's going to be responsible for going on field trips, for showing up in the ways that children need a parent to show up, if you do still have both parents in the labor force, which has become an increasing trend in a lot of American families. In some cases, because people do not want to give up their professions, their professional identity, even once they become a parent, a mother, in most cases. But then also, of course, just because of the economic times we live in order for some families to have middle class, upper middle class status, it does require both parents to work. The other kind of contributing factor to the wage gap is occupational segregation. And that is what we might commonly be called men's jobs and women's jobs. The idea that there are jobs in our society that are predominantly held by one gender over the other. And this graph gives you kind of a look at some of the more occupationally segregated jobs that exist in our society. Things like cleaners, childcare workers, receptionists, preschool teachers, secretaries. Those are jobs that are predominantly held by women. Auto mechanics, truck drivers, airline pilots, engineers. These are jobs that are predominantly held by men. So, what are the causes of that? One contributing cause are cultural beliefs, is that we're raised to think about some type of work as being men's work and some type of work as being women's work. Oftentimes work that is dirty, that involves machines, or hands, outside work, all of that we associate more with men. Any type of work that involves being nurturing or a caretaker, especially for the elderly or the young, we associate that with women. And because we have these cultural beliefs, we kind of socialize people into them early, and so people come into these jobs with different experiences that make them more or less likely to be hired, right? The fact that we buy baby dolls for girls, and trucks for boys. The idea that in high school, female students are more likely to take home ec, and men students are more likely to take mechanics or carpentry. So then when they graduate, it might not be that Otto Bill is discriminating against a woman, but that the male candidate has, 3 years of taking these types of classes in high school, and the woman candidate doesn't. So that's a contributing factor. The role of job prospects, pay, and sexual harassment come into play. So, job prospects is the idea that, if you think that even if you get hired at a lower level for a job, that eventually at some point your gender might be held against you, and you might experience some form of discrimination at higher levels, then it might make you less likely to even just sign up for the initial job, right? So, you might would be hired as a woman as being a mechanic, but or being, I don't know, on the pit crew of a NASCAR team. But if you look around and say, but I don't see any, heads of the crew, all of them are men, so I probably would never ever be advanced to that level, then it might mean that you might be more likely to just say it's not even worth it. Pay, if pay was a motivating factor, you can see that a lot of the male dominated jobs pay more. So, to the extent that, and a lot of female dominated jobs pay less. The one female dominated job that does have pretty good pay, nurses, is a good example, because that is a female dominated job that has seen increasing number of men going into it. While a lot of the female dominated jobs, part of why they remain female dominated is with such a low level of pay. Men are less likely to be interested in those jobs outside of even cultural beliefs. Like, and this is the argument you sometimes hear made about teaching, especially teaching at the lower levels, that the pay is too low for a person to be a provider. And for a lot of men, that sense of being a provider, or the sense of at least not of making more than your female spouse, if you're in a heterosexual couple, is still a motivating factor for a lot of men. And so, in that sense, why go into a female dominated job if you're not going to make as much money? Sexual harassment is a term from your book. This can mean everything from the things you say to the things you do. It can be things like, a clear quid pro quo, where you say things like, I'll give you a promotion if you go on a date with me. It can be things like hostile environment, where basically you create an environment maybe through, um, you know, conversations or what you hang on the walls that make it very uncomfortable for a person of the non-dominant sex in that space to feel comfortable coming into work every day. And so, when you are entering into a job that has occupational segregation, the likelihood that you will experience sexual harassment is increased, more so than if you were in a job where there is gender parity. And so this is another way in which jobs remain occupationally segregated. People don't want to go into a job where they're going to be sexually harassed, or they do go into a job where they're sexually harassed, and they quickly come out of it. They decide that, it's not worth that experience. And we've seen this play out across multiple types of job sectors. And the final kind of contributing factor to occupational segregation is just discriminatory practices in hiring and promotion. You all have probably heard of glass ceiling, and your book uses the term. The idea that there is an invisible barrier that keeps women locked out of upper level positions. And we call it glass because they can see the top positions, but they can't really see a clear path to getting that position. Because oftentimes, once you reach that level, it's no longer about education or experience. It's more about subjective factors like perceptions of your leadership ability and how well you get along with other upper level managers. But then there are some other terms we use in sociology related to glass. We have glass cliffs. That's a term where women are given a top position, but it's because the company is not doing well, is pretty much failing. And so it is a precarious position because it is a good position, but you have very little room for error, or you will fall off. And then that would have a perhaps very negative impact on the remainder of your career. And we have seen in some cases that when women have been granted CEO positions of companies, it has been companies that are in a very precarious time in terms of how well they're doing. Glass walls, in this case, people, once again, usually women for this one, are boxed in to specific segments of a business or a job, and they can go as high up within that one segment, but they probably aren't going to be able to use that experience to cross over into another segment. Best examples of this are like HR or public relations departments. For a lot of banks and businesses, these are non-money making departments that are dominated by women, and you can certainly rise all the way up and be head of HR and be in an upper level management position in public relations, but then that experience probably is not going to allow you to then make a successful case for why you should be considered like CEO or COO, Chief Operating Officer, the same way that a person could if they were in a more instrumental department. The final two, glass escalators and glass floors, apply more so to men. Glass escalators is the idea that you enter in for particularly for men, you enter into a field that is female dominated because of the gender stereotypes associated with leadership and authority. You're more quickly advanced to a position of authority. There's evidence that suggests that this takes place in two fields. That this certainly takes place in at least two fields. One of which, of course, is elementary education, where you have men that enter in as educators and are much more quickly promoted and suggested for administrator positions. So they become principals and vice principals, and at a much faster on a much faster timeline than women who are elementary educators. And the other sense is nursing. Given that nursing is a female dominated field, the fact that nursing managers, that men are disproportionately represented in the nursing manager status, suggests that there might be some glass escalators going on. The idea that you step into a field and with much less effort than your female counterparts, you are quickly raised up in the hierarchy. Glass floors is the opposite in the sense that while it is applicable to men, instead of this being about an advantageous situation in the occupational structure, it's about disadvantages in the occupational structure. So glass floors is the idea that there's some positions that exist in male dominated fields that sometimes men can get stuck in at the bottom of it. So there isn't a clear pathway out of this type of field, and oftentimes these are fields that are more manual labor. They can be very dangerous. They have higher rates of occupational deaths. And so people enter into these fields and, a glass floor is slippery, right? So they're slipping all around on the floor, and unable to grasp a promotional ladder, and potentially, of course, might fall. That's the other reason we call it a glass floor here. Because these jobs are frequently dangerous. And so you can think of things like correctional officers are a good example of a glass floor job. Mining is a good example of a glass floor job. Not a lot of promotions out of the job, and a lot of dangers if you remain for a prolonged period of time at the lower level of the job itself. And so this is it for this presentation. The next presentation picks up with a discussion of gender stratification as it exists in two additional sectors, and those would be politics and violence.